Greetings and salutations. Welcome to Lost in Video, folks. Now, for fans of the channel, I want to apologize. It's been about 10 months or so since I made my last video on the channel, and that's simply because sometimes life gets in the way and it has to take first priority. We all know that. But it's October. That's the good news. So we know for the past 2 years on Lost in Video, I've been posting 31 movies for Halloween. And this year's not going to be any different. We're still going through with that. And I have to say, every year, watching these 31 movies for Halloween just accentuates the love that I already have for what it's already my favorite holiday. Now, just to be clear, these movies are not ranked in any sort of order, and I'm not rating them either. These are simply 31 movies that I watched throughout the month of October to celebrate Halloween. So, the only thing that really makes this year a little bit more special than the past ones is this is the first year where I've never seen any of these movies before. In past years, they were mostly new, but I might have seen one here and there. This year, it's all brand new to me. So, you're going to get a fresh insight from me on that, but without any further ado, why don't we just jump right into it? Number 1, Thanksgiving. First up is Eli Roth's 2023 entry into the horror franchise with Thanksgiving. For those lucky enough to have seen Grindhouse in theaters, you may remember one of the fake movie trailers that played for that double feature was indeed Eli Roth's Thanksgiving. That was in 2007. 16 years later, that fictional trailer has become a movie of its own, and a fun one at that. I have to say, even though I didn't have very high expectations, this movie was very entertaining. It wasn't what I would call a great horror movie or a classic, nor is it a masterpiece, but certain aspects of the film were absolutely ridiculous to the point where I couldn't stop watching. It's probably one of Eli Roth's better movies, and because of that, I have to recommend this one. Number 2, Longlegs. Next, we have an entry from 2024 in Longlegs, directed by Osgood Perkins. Featuring a great lead performance from Micah Monroe, who folks may recognize from movies like It Follows and The Guest, and an absolutely unforgettable supporting performance from Nicolas Cage, this movie seemed to have pretty much come out of nowhere, and it personally blew me away. It definitely had some similarities to, say, Silence of the Lambs for me, but not too much that it didn't feel like its own movie. It's one of my favorite movies of this year, and has some scenes that are definitely creepy enough to make it a worthwhile horror watch, so I highly recommend it. Number 3, Jennifer's Body. We go to 2009 for this next entry, Jennifer's Body. I avoided this movie like the plague when it was first released, firstly because I wasn't really enjoying many horror movies that were being released at that time, and secondly because I was just never a big fan of Megan Fox. Not my favorite actress. However, this year a friend talked me into watching this one, and it honestly wasn't as bad as I thought. There are a few familiar faces that I didn't know were in this movie, and it sort of feels like the film's intention was to be sort of a throwback to movies like Carrie, with a little bit of Pet Sematary in there, and a little bit of silliness along the way as well. My buddy and I were mostly making fun of and laughing our way through the entire movie, but if you're in the mood for something like that, I can recommend it if you have nothing better to do. Number 4, In a Violent Nature. With 2024's In a Violent Nature, director Chris Nash answers the question, what does Jason Voorhees do in between kills on his murder sprees? The answer is he slowly walks through the woods towards his next target. Mind-blowing. The movie is not an entry into the Friday the 13th franchise, but it might as well be, as the similarities are hard to ignore. This was actually a pretty cool concept in my opinion, as we mostly just watch a typical slasher movie play out completely from the perspective of the monstrous killer, but the end result is unfortunately pretty boring. It's like watching a friend play Friday the 13th, the video game, except less entertaining. I'll give the film props for one pretty inventive kill that was probably written by somebody who hates yoga, and there were a couple other cool ones as well, but I can't really recommend this one unless you're in the mood for a very slow-moving slasher where there's not really a whole lot going on. Number 5, Alligator. Now we go back to 1980 for this fun monster movie. Directed by Louis Teague and starring one of my favorites, Robert Forster, Alligator is a movie about a baby pet alligator that gets flushed down the toilet, lands in some toxic sewage, and then grows into a giant monster of an alligator that can't be stopped as it goes on a killing spree. Or can it? This movie is basically Jaws, but if it was an alligator instead of a shark. There's nothing to take seriously, and most of the cast seems to know it. Robert Forster's performance is great as he plays the whole thing straight to the film's benefit, and while I wouldn't recommend this movie to the average person, I would recommend it to anyone who enjoys a good campy monster movie from the 80s. Number 6. Trap. We're back to 2024 for these next two entries, starting with another big swing from hit-or-miss director M. Night Shyamalan with Trap. First of all, I've been a big Josh Hartnett fan for a long time, so it was great to see him back in another prominent role. One of my big complaints about this movie going into it was that the trailer gave away too much of the plot, but man oh man was I incorrect on that. This movie takes a few twists and turns that I didn't really expect, for better or sometimes worse. I'll come out and say outright, by the end of it, it felt like M. Night was kind of shoving his daughter into the movie way more than she needed to be, and because of the character she plays, it takes you out of the movie a little bit, or at least it did for me. Up until the third act, I thought she'd done a good job along with everyone else. There's plenty about the movie that I wasn't really a big fan of, but Hartnett's performance, along with the first two-thirds of the film, were the saving graces of this one for me. Not a bad movie by any means, so I'd recommend it, just don't expect a totally awesome finale because this movie gives you 2 or 3 eye-rolling ones instead. Number 7. Maxine. Next, we have the conclusion to Ti West's critically acclaimed X trilogy with Maxine. This is a continuation of the story of Maxine, the lead character from X, the first movie in this trilogy. Here's what I would have to say about Maxine as it relates to the other movies in the trilogy. I think Pearl is the best made of the 3, but Maxine is probably my favorite of them all. And that's not to say X isn't great too, because it is. This makes Ti West's trilogy of all the more impressive to me. This is very much a giallo film, a brand of horror that I'm a sucker for, and so it was right up my alley and once again features a great performance from Mia Goth. To fans of X and Pearl, I highly recommend it, and I recommend the trilogy to all horror fans because it's a great collection of movies. Number 8. Brain Damage. We go back in time to 1988 for our next entry. Directed by Frank Henenlotter comes a cult classic in Brain Damage, starring Rick Hurst and Jennifer Lowry. In a similar vein to 1980's Basket Case, also directed by Frank Henenlotter, this movie has a dark sense of humor and also relies heavily on body horror for most of its big moments. It definitely revolves around themes about drug addiction and sexuality, but all in all it's mostly just a fun, albeit gross horror movie. There's not much to speak of in terms of the acting, but for this kind of movie, it's not necessarily something where I would expect any Oscar-worthy performances in the first place. I really enjoyed this movie a lot, and I recommend it to those interested in cult classics, body horror, and dark comedy. Number 9. Frankenhooker. Speaking of dark comedy, we go next to 1990 for this cult classic, Frankenhooker. Made with a budget of only $2.5 million, it was always a fool's errand to expect anything serious from a movie called Frankenhooker. It should come as no surprise that this film was also directed by Frank Henenlotter, as his penchant for these movies becomes pretty obvious once you check out his filmography. The effects in this movie aren't great at all, but it's mostly harmless. The dark comedy more than makes up for that, as plenty of moments really had me laughing. All in all, I'd recommend this to the same crowd who might be interested in Brain Damage, as both movies are in the same vein, as well as folks who enjoy cheap horror comedy. Number 10. Slumber Party Massacre. We're going to switch things up, except not really, with 1982's cult classic, Slumber Party Massacre. This one doesn't really play into body horror, as it's more of your traditional slasher with a comedy edge. Directed by Amy Holden Jones, this slasher revolves around some 30-year-old high schoolers having a slumber party on the same day that a maniac escapes from prison. This movie has plenty of humor in its own right, and while I didn't find it as funny as Frankenhooker, for example, it's certainly a fine addition to the slasher genre in and of itself, and definitely comes off satirical throughout its runtime. I recommend it to any fans of 80s slashers. Number 11. Triangle. Next, we go to our second film from the year 2009, Triangle. I'd never heard of this movie before, but a friend recommended it to me, and I have to say, it was certainly an interesting watch. I was absolutely certain I wouldn't be able to even finish the movie during the first 30 minutes, because I was not loving it, but after that things started to pick up, and by the time the film reached its finale, I was invested. Ultimately, it's not the most original movie I've seen, as I've seen others that deal with a similar concept that I won't spoil here. However, it's got enough to stand on its own as a fairly decent little movie. I think fans of independent horror might enjoy this one. Number 12, The Final Girls. Our next entry comes from the year 2015 with The Final Girls. This one was also recommended to me by a friend, and based on the title, I was afraid that the movie would be a little too tongue-in-cheek for my tastes. However, I was way off on that one, as this movie was actually a lot of fun and featured a lot of familiar faces who I didn't expect to see, such as Aaliyah Shawkat from Arrested Development and Adam Devine from Workaholics. There's absolutely a tongue-in-cheek element to the movie, but it's not overwhelmingly silly and in my opinion ended up being pretty enjoyable. I recommend this to fans of horror who like a little fun and comedy mixed in there too. Number 13, Dolls. Coming from the year 1986, our next entry is Dolls, directed by Stuart Gordon and starring Patrick Williams. I was hoping for another campy and fun horror movie with this one, and while the film does deliver on that, it's really nothing much to write home about. There's definitely a dark comedy aspect to this slasher that I love, featuring murderous dolls, and I found plenty of moments to be pretty funny. So on a boring rainy day with nothing else to watch, this one might be worth your time. I wouldn't go out of my way to find it unless you're really into the Puppet Master movies, in which case this one should actually be right up your alley. Number 14, The First Omen. When I first heard the announcement of The First Omen, I was not excited by any means. After all, we just got that pointless Exorcist sequel, which got horrible reviews and failed to interest me enough to even bother with it. However, I love the original 3 Omen movies, and I wasn't looking forward to seeing them drive another beloved IP into the ground. But the trailer for the film eventually grabbed my attention, and when I checked the movie out, I ended up enjoying it quite a bit. I'm not sure where I'd rank it in the Omen franchise, but if I were to commit to saying the first 2 are my favorites, this one might be a close third. Some might even say this is the best one since the original, and it would be hard to dispute that. I recommend this to fans of religious horror, and definitely fans of the Omen. Number 15, House 3, The Horror Show. Released in the United States under the name The Horror Show and internationally as House 3, this 1989 film stars Lance Henriksen of Aliens fame. It's really got nothing to do with the other House movies in my opinion, so I'm not sure why they didn't simply release this under its own name unless it was for the purpose of getting more interest. The movie also has Brian James, who many folks will recognize from Blade Runner as the film's main antagonist, a Freddy Krueger type serial killer. The movie isn't really that great, and although I love Brian James, some of his acting choices in this made it a little hard to take his character seriously. I'd recommend this if you're a fan of Lance Henriksen, but other than that I'd say it's probably not all that worth looking into. Number 16, Uncle Sam. Speaking of not worth looking into, our next entry is Uncle Sam from 1996. This movie is basically about a crazed war veteran who is killed in combat, then returns from the dead to kill residents of his hometown leading up to their big 4th of July parade, and the only person who can get through to him is his nephew. This movie has entertainment value in 2 specific scenes that I can recall off the top of my head, one of which features the late great Robert Forster for a hot minute in a dazzling sequence. The special effects are bad, and a lot of the editing is not great either, and all in all, aside from a few moments that got me to laugh, it really wasn't too enjoyable or memorable. Not sure who I'd recommend this one to. Number 17, When Evil Lurks. Coming from Argentina in the year 2023, When Evil Lurks is a foreign horror film that absolutely got my attention right off the bat. It takes place in a world in which a demonic plague has swept much of society, depicted in a way that I've never really seen before in a horror film. The demonic possessions seem to be passed in a similar way as a virus, and we follow a family as they do all that they can to survive the plague of death that surrounds them. I really enjoyed this movie and I highly recommend it to folks who enjoy bleak movies that revolve around the end of the world, because that's certainly what this film feels like. Number 18, The Visitor. Next up, we have 1979's The Visitor, starring Mel Ferrer, Lance Henriksen, and John Huston. This is one of the more bizarre movies on the list, although one of the more interesting ones as well. One might be tempted to call it a bad ripoff of The Omen, but there's too many other weird things going on in this movie to oversimplify it in that way. There's an extraterrestrial element that is almost reminiscent of Close Encounters of the Third Kind and Rosemary's Baby as well. The main thing that got me to watch this movie was spotting Lance Henriksen's name on the cast list, and I wanted to give him another chance after House 3. This was definitely a more interesting movie than House 3, but not because of Lance Henriksen, who's barely in the movie and looks like he doesn't even want to be there. All in all, it's a weird meshing of a few different movies that you may have already seen, but The Visitor is still worth a look because of how interesting it is in my opinion. Number 19, Infinity Pool. From the year 2023, we next have Infinity Pool, directed by Brandon Cronenberg, the son of the great David Cronenberg. Brandon Cronenberg continues to emulate his dad's directorial style and attachment to body horror, and this film is no different. Starring Alex Skarsgård, Maya Goth, and Cleopatra Coleman, Infinity Pool is a dark and fascinating take on classism and the evils that come with being wealthy enough to buy your way out of any situation, no matter the cost. This movie is not for the weak of heart, and it definitely challenges its audience with some of the questions and statements it raises, including about voyeurism. I highly recommend this to fans who don't mind body horror and enjoy being challenged, without expecting everything to be neatly wrapped up in a bow at the end. Number 20, Evil Dead Rise. I know I'm in a minority of horror fans when I say this, but I sadly was not the biggest fan of the 2013 Evil Dead. I did enjoy the first 3 Evil Dead movies to varying degrees, but it was never my favorite franchise. However, this 2023 entry into the franchise, directed by Lee Cronin, has made me rethink my position on the Evil Dead franchise. I really enjoyed this movie. It was thrilling, disturbing, and had just the right amount of creepiness for horror fans to enjoy. I think what I enjoyed most about this movie was that it didn't feel like a rehash of the first Evil Dead movie, and instead took a different route as far as its setting and story went. We have a new set of characters, a new setting in an apartment in a big city, and new frightening moments that come as a result of these changes. If you're a big Evil Dead fan, you've probably already seen this, but I recommend this to general horror fans as well, if you don't mind a bit of supernatural flavor in your horror. Number 21, Strange Darling. From 2024, we next have Strange Darling, a wonderful little movie that was written and directed by J.T. Mulliner and stars Willa Fitzgerald and Kyle Gallner. I pretty much went into this movie blind, and that's honestly the best way to go into it because I was pleasantly surprised with how little of this film I could actually see coming. The less I say about this one, the better, but I can say that I found it to be very well written, well acted, and well shot. The movie looks great and it's executed perfectly in my opinion. I will say I probably wouldn't consider this a straight-up horror movie in the traditional sense. It certainly does have horror elements, however, and I found the movie to be gripping in its suspense. It was one of my favorite movies of the year, and I highly recommend this one. Number 22, Speak No Evil. Next up from 2024, we have Speak No Evil. This remake of a 2022 Danish-Dutch film was directed by James Watkins and stars James McAvoy, Mackenzie Davis, and Scoot McNairy. I didn't approach this movie the same way as fans of the original did, simply because I had not seen or even heard of the original Speak No Evil, despite it being released only 2 years ago. Therefore, I didn't have the highest of expectations, but the movie trailer gives you a good idea of what's coming. It's not the best movie that I've seen this year, but I did enjoy it quite a bit. I will say that unsurprisingly, James McAvoy gives a powerhouse performance as the villain that pretty much carried the movie to me. This might fall into the thriller category more so than horror, but it was a welcome addition to my October viewing experience. I recommend this to fans of thrillers, and definitely fans of James McAvoy should check it out. Number 23, Hell House LLC Origins. From 2024, Hell House LLC Origins is the next movie on our list. This found footage horror movie is the fourth installment in the Hell House franchise, but only the second one I've seen following the first Hell House film. From everything I've gathered beforehand, I'm fairly certain I didn't need to see the previous two Hell House movies to understand what was going on in this one. That turned out to be the case, although I can't really say I loved this movie. It seemed to drag for me at certain points, and while it doesn't even come close to some of the worst movies I've seen, it's a tricky one to recommend. I guess the easiest audience to recommend this one to would be fans of the found footage horror genre, because if you've run out of Paranormal Activity movies to scratch that itch, this one just might do it for you. Other than that, it really wasn't that interesting to me. Number 24, Beezle. I had no idea what to expect with this next entry on our list, 2024's Beezle. The reason for that being, I've heard some people say this was the scariest movie to come from 2024, and I've heard others say it was just outright bad. I tend to agree with those saying it's just bad. For me, it's repetitive, and I feel they might have been better off just keeping the first 20 minutes or so of this film as a creepy little short, because after that things start to go downhill fast, at least for me, and the film never fully recovers in my opinion. Then again, as I said, some people did seem to enjoy this movie, so if you're into movies where the same thing keeps happening to different groups of characters who you don't get a chance to care about over and over again with the same results each time, you might actually like this movie. To everyone else, I can't in good conscience recommend this. Number 25, May. Coming from 2002 and from absolutely nowhere comes May, directed by Lucky McKee and starring Angela Bettis, Jeremy Sisto, and Anna Faris. For some reason, I remember seeing this movie around all the time back in the video rental store days, but I never knew what it was about or even what genre it was, and I never thought to look. 20 years later, and I ended up checking it out by happenstance, and I have to say I really like this one. It's an interesting story about an awkward vet assistant who falls in love with a guy because she loves his hands. Sounds quirky and cute, and it is. For a little bit. Like I said, I never knew anything about this movie, but the lead actress, Angela Bettis, does a great job, and it was cool seeing Anna Faris, as well as Jeremy Sisto, who some people might recognize from the show 6 Feet Under. It's not really a straight-up horror movie either, but it's pretty creepy at points, and it definitely earns my recommendation. Number 26, Late Night with the Devil. 2023's Late Night with the Devil also seemingly came out of nowhere, at least to me, but this is another one that I really enjoyed. It's virtually about a special episode of a talk show, the point of which is to exploit the superstitions of its audiences by presenting, and in some cases attempting to debunk, events and people that may or may not be truly supernatural. It's a very basic movie in the sense that it all takes place inside the talk show's studio, and the acting, while in some cases a little over the top and campy, is still enjoyable at all times, and the editing and effects are well done. This one was written and directed by brothers Colin and Cameron Cairns, and stars David Dastmalchian, if I'm saying that right, and I'm probably not, as the host of the show. I definitely recommend this one, especially around Halloween. Number 27, Eden Lake. James Watkins makes his second appearance on this list with his directorial debut, 2008's Eden Lake. Watkins also wrote the movie, which stars Kelly Riley and Michael Fassbender. The movie is about a couple who go for a vacation to a remote location, only to cross a dangerous group of two teenagers who begin to stalk them through the woods. I wanted to like this movie, and I kept waiting for the movie to pick up the pace despite the fact that things were happening. It just never completely got going for me, and while it was pretty dark, it didn't have the impact that I felt it was attempting to make. The movie is made competently, and I would say Watkins definitely got things right in Speak No Evil, where it may have been lacking in Eden Lake. Again, this feels more like a thriller to me than a straight-up horror movie, and I didn't really love it at all, but I'd recommend it to fans of thrillers and people who think Children of the Corn needed an update. Number 28, VHS Beyond. The latest addition to the VHS franchise, VHS Beyond gives the found footage saga a new spin with this film. I love a good anthology movie, and this one definitely scratched that itch. Unlike previous VHS movies, this one leaned less into the direct horror genre and instead blended the horror with tales that all revolved around a science fiction theme. This made it feel like a fresh entry, and I found myself enjoying the majority of the stories, with a couple misses mixed in there as well. However, that's par for the course with these types of movies, so I still recommend this one to science fiction fans as well as fans of horror anthologies. Number 29, Night of the Creeps. Finally, back to 1986 we go for our next entry on this list, Night of the Creeps. I didn't look anything up about this movie before I put it on, so this was a pleasant surprise. As soon as I saw that this movie starred Halloween 3's Tom Atkins, I got pumped up, as anyone in their right minds knows that Tom Atkins is awesome. Night of the Creeps is about some evil alien sludge that contaminates humans and then causes slugs to explode out of their heads as they go around infecting everyone they can. Our main characters are two college kids who unknowingly release the slugs into the town, as well as Tom Atkins, who plays a detective with a dark past who investigates the deaths. This movie is pure camp and fun, and everyone, including Tom Atkins, who's having a blast, know exactly what kind of movie this is. For fans of great 80s camp, I highly recommend this sci-fi comedy horror. It's definitely one of my favorite horror movies that I've watched this year. Number 30, Alien Romulus. Fans of the Alien franchise have been yearning for a new entry that wouldn't disappoint for a very, very long time. It's pretty much universally agreed upon that the first two Alien movies are each fantastic in their own right, but then for one reason or another, things go downhill from there. However, after the fairly disappointing reception that Alien Covenant received, it seems that now the franchise finally has turned things around with Alien Romulus. If I'm being honest, this movie feels like a mashup of the first two movies, while also tying into Prometheus a little bit as well. That doesn't stop it from being a compelling sci-fi horror movie though, and I have to say it was refreshing to once again finally watch a new Alien movie that I thoroughly enjoyed. I recommend this movie especially to fans of the Alien franchise, as well as fans of sci-fi horror in general. Number 31, Inferno. For those who have seen my last two Halloween videos, you'll appreciate that of course this year, I once again had to include a film by the great Italian giallo director, Dario Argento. Inferno was a follow-up to perhaps Argento's most famous movie, Suspiria. Everything that makes Suspiria great in terms of visual storytelling is present here once again, and I cannot express enough how much I love the way this movie looks. However, where Suspiria outshines its successor is in the plot. There isn't very much of a story here in Inferno, and it's not really anything we haven't seen before. However, it's still absolutely worth a watch if you're a giallo fan, a fan of Argento, or a fan of dreamlike sequences and visual storytelling. Well, another year done and another 31 Halloween movies watched. I want to personally thank my viewers who have stuck around, even though I haven't made a video in, a little while. Nonetheless, I had such a great time watching these movies as I do every year, so I just want to wish you all a happy Halloween. I want to thank you for joining me, and once again, I want to thank you for getting lost in video. Have a happy Halloween and have a good one.